My name is Rick Dorrington. I'm a community producer at LexMedia, and we're here with James Shepard, who just gave a speech in town called "Why Everyone Is Needed." James, how are you?
Great. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks for inviting me today.
No, for sure, for sure. It's great to
Yeah.
finally connect with you.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to start off a little bit like I know you've kind of been like honing the speech and working on it. Talk a little bit about your background and how you got into Christian Science.
Yeah. Well, my parents were Christian Scientists, so I grew up going to Christian Science Sunday school, and we Sunday school there we taught the Bible, and so we were raised out in the country, and my brothers and I mean, we romped around the woods, and we always had our fair share of bruises and scrapes, and some, not very often, but once in a while we'd get ill, and so my parents always turned to Christian Science for all our needs, and found that they were always taken care of. And I think probably in most people's lives, maybe around in college, you kind of have to start, you leave home and start having to either make something for yourself. And I never felt like there was ever any time when all of a sudden it was like, oh, now I'm going to be a Christian Scientist. But um, I always found it practical and useful, and I was always wanting to know, what's life really all about, kind of those deeper issues. And so I just sort of continued with the study on through. I ended up getting married, and then I was living on this ranch, working on this ranch, and kind of decided that maybe helping others find healing through prayer was a way in which I could be a better help for the world. And so, yeah, it's been about 30 years ago. Uh, Decided to move to a bigger town here in Eugene, Oregon, and went into this Christian Science practitioner, which, as you know, is helping people find healing through Christian Science. I think that's probably a good synopsis.
Yeah,
I mean, there's a lot of things along the way that happen.
for sure, for sure. That's a great
Yeah.
answer. But so it wasn't really something you strayed away from, and then like you had this big aha moment where you came back to it. It was just
Yeah.
kind of like throughout your whole life had been something like able to explain some of the questions you had.
Right. Yeah, I know for a lot of people it is sometimes that straying and then having this aha moment, but it
Right.
didn't really seem that way for me. No.
Very cool. And how is it? How is it over in Eugene, Oregon? Like, do you have your own practice there, or is it a church there? Are there a lot of Christian Scientists? To paint the picture a little bit out there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, there's a church here in Eugene, Oregon, and in obviously many different towns. And Eugene's about maybe pushing close to 200,000. So,
Oh wow. Okay.
people as far as population. So there's a lot of folks here. And so, yeah, we have a regular building downtown, and with the governor's orders with this COVID stuff, we closed down it wasn't very long, for a couple of months, but and we still have services online, but we also now are meeting back together, and that's kind of nice to get back together. Did I answer that question? Was there anything more in there?
No,
So,
no, that's perfect. It's
I
just more
mean, we'd
kind of,
always like to have, as far as size, we'd always like to have a few more folks show up, but that's not really our focus. Really, it's just trying to help out however we can. So.
for sure. Are there a couple, like you said this in your last answer, but like, there are some very practical sort of like tools or is something you can point to in Christian Science that have like really helped you or that like kind of woke you up a little bit? Can you give us a couple examples of some of those like
Mm.
practical things that people can really learn?
Well, I think the tools that we really have, I mean, the Bible's the main tool. We have a Bible lesson that's published by the church headquarters. And so churches around the world, or people in those churches, or students of Christian Science, study the same topic each week. And it's a Bible lesson. And so it's a Bible along with the book Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary
Right.
Baker Eddy. So those are kind of the tools that we use, but
Yeah.
there's also, as far as in church, the fellowship and different meetings, sometimes different gatherings, and talking with people. So, yeah, I'd say those are the basic tools.
That's great. That's awesome. And so this speech, why everyone is needed. Can you talk a little bit about like how you honed this? Why this particular topic? So like the sense of like belonging and what do we do with our time here. So just talk a little bit about how you kind of crafted this, because I know you've been kind of perfecting it and working on it and trying to get it out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Originally, when I was invited to be on the board of lectureship, the Christian Science board of lectureship, then you write like a synopsis or what you want to talk about. And I can't remember what my original topic was, but I had like an editor helping me, and maybe it wasn't the best. And she was like, well, what if there was one thing that you wanted to tell the world or tell other people, what would it be? And that just, it's been a big part of my life, just feeling needed. I just think it's so important. And so then we started with this writing this talk about why everyone's needed, and it just seemed to really hit at an important time, right when everyone was, so many people were just in their houses, and wondering, am I really needed? And so that's kind of how it came about.
For
I can't
sure.
imagine really talking about anything else right now, because that seems to be such so needed.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
I mean, so, and I can anticipate your answer here, but who would you say that this lecture is for? Like, who's your target audience?
Just anyone in the public, anyone who's maybe interested in either, maybe they have a sense of they need to be more needed, and also I think for people, and I talk about this a little bit in the talk, addressing these larger world problems. How do we work on these things with the economic disparity, the racial injustice issues, and anyone who wants to get a better grip on those, or maybe wants to help out, if we can start with this basis of that everyone else that we're working with here, and sometimes there's conflict. How do we have that conflict resolution? So really anyone who's interested in either for themselves or on this broader picture of how we can better help view others that way.
Very cool. No, that's a great answer. And can you point to some, maybe like a couple bullet points or specifics that people can take away from this, right? Like, are there like sort of practical tools you have inside of the speech that you think will resonate with people?
Well, I think, I mean, I think that we're often told, or we've often been told in school maybe or something, that, oh, you're needed or you're special or whatever it is. And it's certainly not from this sense of, it's why we're needed is in God's plan, in God's universe, needed to express those qualities of God. And as we find that we're really getting a much broader sense of what God is, a bigger sense. If God is infinite, we can't ever fully know all there is about God. And if we see that God is the cause of all there is, and then recognizing, well, what's the effect? Every cause has to have an effect, and then realizing, oh, that's me. That's why I'm here, to express that goodness of God. And that's what gives us sort of permanent value and worth, is in our connection to God, not in, us being the president of some company or whatever it is we are actually doing, but how we're doing it, how we're expressing God's love for everyone else. And it's God's love that's needed, and that's being expressed through us, and our unique individual expression of God to help, as I say, complete God's infinite universe.
Very cool. That's a great answer. And I think, yeah, like a lot of those big ideas, right, is like you might have this aha moment and it feels great. You feel this connection, but daily life, you got to go back to school, you got to go back to work. This thing sort of gets distilled back down, and just sort of titrates it or drips into like this, you get the in sort of small doses. But what do you hope people take away? And, you learn the big thing, and then, how can this help them in their daily lives? And what do you hope people can take away from this stuff and these larger lessons, I guess?
Yeah, well, my hope is that people can start seeing that, just sort of keeping that larger sense, as you said, that bigger sense of God, the bigger sense of the universe, bigger sense of what it means to be loved and to love others, to take that bigger sense, to kind of be consciously, to take that effort to consciously be aware of that, as you meet with your boss and you have this little problem, or trying to figure out where your kids are doing in school or whatever, is to keep sort of taking your thought back moment by moment throughout the day to this bigger picture of God and God's goodness that's always here, and then trying to be able to find it and recognizing, okay, there is a solution here, and we can find this in God's goodness and allness.
Beautiful. I think that's great. Now I'm just going to ask you, maybe just give like a quick intro on why we're needed. Just kind of like give us a couple bullet points, what we're going to learn here, and then we can just kind of segue it right into your speech.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, I'm going to be giving a talk here on why everyone's needed, and I'd love to have everyone who can really take the time to join in with me. I'm going to talk about what it means what our purpose really is in life, and what it means to why it's so important to be needed, what it means to view ourselves and others from a more spiritual or godlike point of view, and how that has an impact on our lives and on the lives of others. So as we find that value and worth, then we'll find that it has an impact not only on our lives, but on everyone's life. I hope you'll join me for our little discussion here on why everyone's needed.
Welcome and hello. My name is Elaine Jarvis, and I'm a member of the First Church of Christ Scientists in Lexington, Massachusetts. Our church is so very pleased to be able to sponsor this lecture by James Shepherd, entitled Why Everyone is Needed. Lexington and neighboring towns are thought to be at the beginning and center of American independence back in 1775. For many of us, the study of Christian Science brings with it a sense of independence from the limitations that seem to come along in our day-to-day living. James Shepherd has been a Christian Science practitioner for over 30 years, devoting his time and study to helping others with healing. James loves spending time with his family, friends, and all things outside, but his greatest joy is sharing God's tangible love for everyone. He comes to us via the computer from his home in Eugene, Oregon. Please welcome James Shepherd.
Well, thank you, Elaine. Thank you for that warm welcome and introduction. And thank you to your church, First Church of Christ Scientist in Lexington, Massachusetts, for inviting me to come to talk today. And hello to you all, wherever you might be. I'm just so looking forward to spending the next hour or so with you, just sharing some of the things that I'm learning along these lines of why everyone is needed. Well, you don't need me sitting here to tell you that there's a lot of people who are really struggling, going through some tough times. People with some really serious concerns, like, am I going to have a job? Am I going to be able to put food on the table? How can I stay safe through this pandemic? How can I keep my family safe? Well, getting a clear understanding of who we all really are really helps us navigate through these difficult waters. And it can even help us reason through what seem to be some of the intractable problems in the world, like the polarization between groups of people, some of the social, racial inequality. So what we're going to talk about today is what our purpose is and why we're needed. We're going to talk about what it means to view ourselves and others from a more spiritual or godlike point of view, and how that has such an impact on our lives and on the lives of others. We're going to be talking about all of this from the perspective of Christian Science. And Christian Science is deeply rooted in the Bible. and especially in the words and works of Christ Jesus. And Jesus really showed that as we get a clear sense of the nature of God, that helps us get a clear sense of our connection to God and of our true nature. Well, for starters, let's just get a little bit of a clear sense of what it means to really be needed or to really be valued. And in order to do that, I'd like you all to imagine something with me. Imagine that you're a bolt, just one of those thousands of bolts you might find in hardware stores, maybe in Lexington or maybe in all of Massachusetts. If you're just one little bolt, how valuable do you feel? Probably not very valuable, right? What if you found you were a specially made bolt? Well, that might help a little bit. And what if you found that your purpose was to hold a carburetor onto an engine? And that you were the only bolt in the world that could do that? And that engine was the only engine in the world that fit on a machine that made gold? And that was the only gold-making machine in the world. So without you, gold couldn't be made. Now how valuable do you feel? Millions of people would be dependent on you, workers and their families. Without you, there wouldn't be any of those industries that use gold. There wouldn't be any computers or laptops or electronics. They all use gold. There wouldn't be any works of art or jewelry that uses gold. All this just because of you, this one little specially made bolt. Well, as we're going to explore today, every person is needed even more than that bolt is needed in God's universe. We've all been specially made by God. So we're not just some unneeded or unnecessary part. We're not one among billions and billions of identical parts. No, each and every one of us is unique. And each and every one of us has been created on purpose and with purpose. I'd like to share a story with you now about a woman who discovered her purpose and worth. And it illustrates how this can have such an impact in so many areas of our lives. This woman grew up in a very dysfunctional family. It was abusive. She was never told that she was valued or needed or even loved. And she had a lot of periods where she had deep depression and times when she thought about taking her life. This all came to a head when she was in college. At that point, she was nearly flunking out of school. She didn't have any money. She hadn't really learned how to develop any sort of deep relationships with anyone. And she was addicted to drugs. Well, one night, one dark, restless night, she was thinking about all of these things, and her life just seemed so hopeless. And she came to the heart-wrenching conclusion that ending her life was her only option. So the next day, she wrote a suicide note, gave her dog to her sister and her plant to someone else, and she headed for the Golden Gate Bridge to jump off and end her life. But as she was headed there, she realized that she was pretty close to her ballet studio. So she thought she would just swing by there first. Well, she knocked. Nobody answered. She tried the knob. It was locked. It was 9 in the morning and nobody was there. And that was the final straw. She just collapsed to the pavement, sobbing. Well, there did happen to be someone there. The company director was in her office upstairs and she heard the commotion. So she came down and then she comforted this woman. Then she took her up to her office and they chatted for a bit. And then she said, you know, I have this book, and I think you might find it helpful. And she showed her a copy of this book, Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures, written by the founder of the Christian Science movement, Mary Baker Eddy. Now, this book shows the Christian Science approach to understanding the Bible and how we can live and experience those promises that are in the Bible. You know, the Bible's just full of promises of health and safety, of forgiveness, of redemption, reformation. But religion was the last thing in the world that this woman thought she wanted. But because the company director was so kind to her, she took the book and then headed off. She went to a nearby bar and ordered a beer, kind of thumbed through the pages a little bit and wondered, what in the world am I going to do with this book? But then she decided that she would read it, and she would read it to show how ridiculous Christianity and religion were. And with that, she went home. She forgot all about her previous decision to end her life until she read her own suicide note sitting there on the kitchen table. So she started reading Science and Health. And she fought and she struggled with all of those ideas that it was presenting. These were new ideas about the nature of God, that God was a God of love and a forgiving God and an all-good God. And new ideas about herself as God's offspring, that her true nature was entirely good as well, and that she was pure and innocent and lovable. Well, you know, the more she read that book, the more it started to make sense. And she noticed that her life was starting to turn around. School became easier to her. She started getting better grades, and she not only graduated from college, but she went on and ended up getting a master's degree. That the supply that had been so difficult for her, such a stress to ever have any money. Well, whatever she needed came more naturally to her in her life, and never again did she feel so stressed about finances and money. She started learning how to develop deeper friendships and relationships. Later, she ended up getting married and had a long, loving marriage. The desire for drugs just fell away as well. And all of those depressing times that she'd had and thoughts of committing suicide, ending her life, those slowly faded away as well until they disappeared completely. Her whole life was transformed and changed. So what was it? What was it that took her from thinking of her so lowly of herself that she was ready to take her own life to a place where she just valued her life and lived life to the fullest? Well, she said that probably the most important thing is just getting this sense that she had a place, that she had a purpose, which was to live her life as that wonderful person that God had created her to be. Now, when she'd been growing up, she was taught that God was this bearded old man up in the sky, and maybe sometimes he would help and sometimes not. She certainly hadn't felt any help from that sort of God, and that's why she'd given up on God and on religion. But as she read this book, God just became alive to her, and she could feel the power and presence and love of God in her life. Well, if God isn't this bearded man up in the sky somewhere, who or what is God? What was it that she was learning about the nature of God that transformed her life in all those different areas? Well, we can go right to the Bible. Jesus said that God is spirit. So God's not some person somewhere, but a power or presence that we might not be able to see, but we can feel and we can see the effects of. The Bible says that God is truth, and truth is whatever is real, actual, tangible, whatever is good in our lives is from God as truth. The Bible says that God is life, life itself, vitality, what gives us vitality, activity, what gives us health and joy. And the Bible says that God is love. Just about every Bible story is a story about God's love for God's offspring and how God helps us and saves us. The Bible also has accounts where it tries to describe this love of God. And here's one of the descriptions. Like an eagle that rouses her chicks and hovers over her young, so he spread his wings to take them in and carry them aloft on his pinions or on his feathers. And what I really love about this passage is it shows several different aspects to God's love. It talks about God hovering over us or doting over us, tenderly knowing all of our needs and supplying us with all that we need. And yet it also shows the power of God's love to just take us on its wings, up and over whatever obstacles are in our way, whatever dark times we might be going through. Well, as we continue to build this understanding of God, there's another place in the Bible where the Bible often refers to God as being the only creator or the only cause. Now, in order to be a cause needs what? It needs an effect, right? I mean, there can't be a cause without an effect. If you blow on a horn or beat on a drum, if that's the cause, there's going to be an effect, which is sound or noise or maybe hopefully even music. Well, it's the same with God, being infinite, spirit and truth and life needs to be expressed through joy and activity, through our love and care for each other. And that's what shows us our purpose. Our purpose is the effect of all that godlikeness coming from God, all that goodness coming from God. Now, God is infinite, so God must be expressed in an infinite amount of ways. But if any one of us didn't exist, then God wouldn't be infinite, wouldn't be infinitely expressed. And so that helps show us why we're needed to help complete that infinite universe of God, to help complete all of that goodness of God. So that's why we're all needed. Well, these are some pretty big ideas about God, and you might have heard of some of them, and maybe some of them you haven't. But what it's important is to take these ideas as more than just some sort of nice sounding, flowery thoughts about God or about God's goodness, and to be able to put them into practice, into use in our life, like that woman who I talked about earlier was able to really use these ideas to transform her life. And that's where this book, Science and Health, can be so valuable. It helps us get this clearer picture of God and gives us new and fresh inspiration. Now, the author of this book, Mary Baker Eddy, she wasn't interested in just some sort of theology or some sort of philosophy. She wasn't writing from some white ivory tower, disconnected from her everyday life. She had a lot of challenges in her life. And so she was looking for solutions to the problems in her life. So while the ideas in this book come from the Bible, they really grew and developed out of her desperate need for healing. Mary Baker Eddy was born in Bow, New Hampshire, just about 60 miles north of Lexington. And I have a photo here of her home where she was raised and grew up. Now, this photo was taken in about 1900, and she was born in 1821, so it was a little later that this photo was taken, but it gives an idea of the atmosphere that she was born into, living on this farm in New England. And I'd say for a young girl growing up in that time period in the country, she had a pretty normal childhood. She did have some bouts with chronic illness, and that got worse gradually over the years, and that kept her in bed maybe a little more than some others. She had some hardship and suffered some loss in her teens. But then in her early 20s, she fell in love and got married, and it looked like things were looking up for Mary Baker Eddy. But less than a year after her marriage, her husband caught yellow fever and died. And so she was left alone and pregnant. Well, her family helped take care of her through some of her physical challenges and illness, and also helped with the bringing up of her baby, who then became a toddler, a young boy. But after some years, they decided maybe it would be best to send that boy to another family. And so off he went. And then a couple of years after that, that family moved to the Midwest. And you can imagine, with the way that communications were back then and transportation, that she didn't have much of an opportunity to get any kind of relationship with her only child. So in a sense, in a short period, she'd lost her husband and her only child. And you add to that, you can imagine how for a woman in that period, this is before women could vote, how difficult it would be for a single woman or to find any kind of sustainable work. And you add to that the chronic illness that she suffered from. If there was anyone who had reason to feel of little value, it could have been Eddy. She kind of struggled through her 30s, and it was then in her 40s that she had a life-changing event. She was healed from the effects of an accident that many people thought would end her life. And she was healed just by reading a passage from the Bible. Now, she'd always read the Bible ever since she was young. She found so much comfort there. And she read this passage, and something clicked. And she started to feel better. And she got up and started to go about her daily activities. Well, she was just so happy to be free from that pain, from that accident. But she was also puzzled. You see, at first, she didn't see the connection between that healing of Jesus that she'd been reading about and how that had made her feel, that connection to the goodness of God, and then how that had healed her body. So she dug into the Bible to find out what it was. And it took some time, but gradually she started to realize that all that exists in God's universe, in God's allness and goodness, must be entirely good. Therefore, whatever's not good in our lives, maybe pain from an accident or illness or whatever's inharmonious in our lives, that has no place in God's all goodness. And therefore, it has no real basis in who any of us truly are as God's offspring. She also came to find that what we experience in our lives is dependent upon our perspective of things, the degree to which we see what's real, which is this goodness coming from God, and what's not real, whatever's not godlike. Well, she was eventually healed not only from the effects of that accident, but from all that chronic illness that she'd suffered from ever since she was young. And she went on to be a well-known healer in her time. Now, for Mary Baker Eddy, healing wasn't just thinking good thoughts and then good things happen. It's always good to be positive, but for her, healing really came from feeling that connection to an all-good God, an inseparable connection. And later on, as she understood this and was more able to put it down, she wrote this really great sentence. It is our ignorance of God, the divine principle, which produces apparent discord, and the right understanding of him restores harmony. So here she's using this word principle as just another aspect to God, just showing another nature, another part of God's nature. And principle shows that God is the basis, the source, the foundation of all there is. So we could say it's our ignorance that God is our source, our foundation, which produces apparent discord. We could say it's our ignorance of God's infinite love or unchangeable truth, which brings apparent discord. And the right understanding of God restores harmony. Well, we all have things going on in our lives, and then there's the larger world issues going on. How do we get this right understanding of God in the face of all these troubles and difficulties? Well, that's where prayer fits in. Now, prayer can be so many different things. It could just be a God help me or God help them when we're in trouble. And at least that recognizes the power and presence of God. But using this clearer sense of God's nature that we've been discussing so far, let's dig in a little more deeply to the nature of God to show us how prayers can be effective in our lives. First off, I've been talking a lot about the allness of God. So since God is all-knowing, in our prayers, we don't have to try to inform God about something. God already knows all that's real and good and true about every one of us. And since God is all-loving, our prayer isn't a pleading with God to help us. God's love for us is unconditional. And since God is everywhere, prayer isn't somehow trying to get connected to God. We're already connected. And prayer helps us see that by looking past the surface level of the surface level of things. Now, prayer doesn't ignore the problems, doesn't ignore the difficulties, it doesn't ignore how painful it can feel sometimes when we're sick or some of the real dire situations we might find ourselves in. But it's really the way to eliminate these things. You know how sometimes we seem to be this mixture of physical and spiritual elements. Maybe our world seems to be that way, this mixture. Well, prayer helps us see that that is just a really tiny, limited sense of who we all really are. And as we turn to God and recognize our true nature as all that comes from God, then that's what brings transformation to our lives. And that dim, distorted, shadowy, distant stuff just falls away. I like to go backpacking. I like to camp outdoors at night. And you know, at night, things can look a lot different. We just see just a sort of a limited sense of what's there. If we let our imagination carry us away, and maybe our fears, that stump can turn into a bear. We might be afraid of it all night. But then at the first coming of light, we start to see things gradually more and more clearly for what they're really like. Their shape and color, the bushes, the landscape, the trees. And that bear turns back into a stump. And that's a little bit of the way that prayer brings about healing, by bringing to light the truth of our undeniable connection to God. I'd like to share a healing here of a woman that highlights a little bit on how this kind of Christian Science prayer can be so useful in our lives. Now, this woman, one day she started to feel ill, and she felt a pain in her abdomen, and it quickly increased until it was the worst pain she'd ever been in her whole life, and it wasn't going away. It was the kind of pain that might make someone want to go to the emergency room, and she knew she could do that. That was always an option. But she'd also been healed before through this kind of Christian Science prayer, so she decided to pray. Now, there's no formula to prayer, but I'd like to share a little bit about how prayer came to her that one day, because sometimes that can be helpful. Well, the first thing is that she realized that she was just so consumed with that pain that it was really hard for her to focus or think of anything else. And she knew that she had to try as hard as she could to put that out, to put out that pain, and maybe some of the fear, some of the questions like, what is it? How long is it going to last? Is it serious? Put that all out and direct her focus to what emanates from God, the allness and goodness of God. And she said as she did that, her thought kind of quieted down a little bit. And then the prayer that came to her was a kind of reasoning. And it was very simple. It went like this. The first part was that since God is all good, God never sent or allowed pain or illness of any kind. And the second was that since God is all powerful, pain or illness have no power in God's universe. And therefore, they have no real basis in who she really is either. And she said, thinking of all this really helped her feel taken care of. It helped her feel that inseparable connection to God, made her feel loved and cared for and valued. Well, her husband was praying along with her as well. And then a little later, he started to read out loud from this book, Science and Health. And what he read just reinforced this feeling that she was getting of this inseparable connection to God's goodness. And as he read, she said the pain started to go away. And pretty soon it was gone completely. And it never came back. Well, you can imagine the freedom and sense of empowerment that would give someone to go from this place of being in the worst pain you've ever been in to a place of prayer and quietness, and then feeling that unshakable connection to goodness, and then having that pain go away completely. She and her husband were just so grateful. Well, that's one sharing of one experience, one healing someone had. But you'll find that in Christian Science, healing like that is very common. There's Christian Science societies and churches around the world that have Sunday services, and then they also hold Wednesday meetings. And during those Wednesday meetings, there's a portion where people share healing that they're having. Matter of fact, First Church of Christ Science in Lexington. we're going to put up a slide at the end of the talk, which will give you some contact information there, so you could go and visit one of their meetings right now. They're online, so you could visit them. The church headquarters is in Boston, and every week and then every month they put out magazines. And in every one of them, there are accounts of people, just everyday folks, who've been healed through this sort of Christian Science prayer. Matter of fact, this book, Science and Health, the last 100 pages, all it is healings, accounts of healings. In this case, of people who were healed just by reading the book. So you can see there's a mountain of evidence that shows the healing effectiveness of this kind of Christian Science prayer. So today, where we are in this pandemic, a lot of people have gotten their shots, or maybe their second shot, or they're looking towards getting this immunization to keep them safe through the pandemic. And I know quite a few people who've already gotten the shots, and it just makes me so happy to see them when they just look like they have a load lifted off their shoulders. We can also see with this mountain of evidence that we don't have to wait for a shot to feel safe. We can depend on this healing power. And we also don't have to be afraid of taking that shot either. In either case, this kind of Christian Science prayer, we know, can keep us safe through anything. Just a couple of months ago, mid-November, I went to visit a couple of family members over the pass into nearby valley, spent the day with them overnight, did a bunch of activities, and then the next day, and then I headed back home. During the time, one of them hadn't been feeling very well. Well, a few days after returning home, I got the text that they'd gone in and tested positive for COVID. And so they were informing me that I'd been exposed. Well, the first thing I did was think of some of these ideas that I've been sharing with you, just about how all there can be is the effect of God, and it has to be entirely godlike. And that's for me and for everyone else. And then I thought, well, who have I come into contact with since then? And it had only been 2 couples. So I called them and let them know that I'd been exposed so they could handle it however they felt best. And then I went into a self-imposed quarantine period for 2 weeks. That was nice because friends brought me my food. But I wouldn't say it was always easy. There's been just so much in the media, in the news, so much about the symptoms and so much fear that I really had to watch my thought. And sometimes I just had to be aware of what was coming in. And I could think of thoughts, I could see sometimes thoughts like, if there was a tickle in my throat or maybe a scratch in my throat, is that COVID? Are those COVID symptoms? And I had to push those out like those dark images and turn my focus to the allness and goodness of God. And then I wasn't afraid anymore. I stayed healthy through that whole 2 weeks. So did the 2 couples that I had come into contact with, my family members, they suffered mild symptoms, but they quickly got over them as well. And in a situation like this, it's hard to say for sure exactly what it was that kept me or us safe. But I can say that I see a definite connection between what we're thinking, what we're letting into our thought, how we're praying, and how things tend to shake out in our lives. Well, so far, I've laid the groundwork for what it is that gives us our worth, what it is that makes us needed. And it's that we're that needed effect of God, all those godlike qualities that are so needed. So let's dig into this a little more deeply. And let's start by, let's take 5 seconds and let's all think about what are some of the things that the world says gives us our value or worth. Just take 5 seconds and I'll do the same. All right, you got some things? I'm thinking about things like, well, how much money we have. The world says that makes us valuable. Could be our occupation, our ethnicity, our gender, our age, our body type, our family background, on and on and on. These are all things that the world says gives us our value. I'm sure you thought of a lot of other things. Let's take all these things and just for fun, just for today, put them all in one bunch. And let's call it the Human Worthiness Index. Now, sometimes we might feel pretty high on that Human Worthiness Index. And other times we might feel kind of low. Or we might feel that others are kind of high or low on that Human Worthiness Index as well. But don't you think there's things other than that that really determine our value and worth? Let's do this. Let's each take another 5 seconds and let's think about someone that we really value or that we really find worthy. And I'll do the same. Well, you got someone? The person that I'm thinking of this time, the reason that I find them to be really valuable in my life, really worthy, is that they're very honest. They're full of integrity. I just always know that they're going to always be trying to do the right thing. I can depend on that. And I wonder who it is that you thought of, or maybe more important, why you feel that they're valuable. I bet it had nothing to do with that Human Worthiness Index. Didn't have to do with how bright and shiny their car is or how big their house is. But it has more to do with those deeper, more spiritual, more godlike qualities, like I was describing with my friend. It could be that they're just always so happy and joyous, or it could be they're so intelligent, or that they're so caring and loving. These are all these deeper, more godlike qualities. And actually, that's all that gives us our worth and value. That's all that makes us needed, because those are the qualities coming from God. And we can also see that those qualities are really the entirety of who we all really are. If it's not godlike, it has no part in our true nature or anyone else's. You know, Jesus saw the value in others better than anyone. And just the fact that he healed people showed that they were valued and worthy enough to be healed. And he healed all kinds of people, all kinds of religions, race. It didn't matter what their age was or what their politics were. He healed people who were rich as well as the poor. He healed those who were accepted in society as well as the outcasts. And he healed, rather than judged or condemned, those who had made all kinds of mistakes and messed up in sometimes some pretty bad ways. And he could do that because he could see that godlikeness was the entirety of who they all really were. So whatever that disease or whatever that character trait was that he was healing, that would just fall away, just drop off like that dark, limited, shadowy sense as he shone that truer, clearer picture of who they really were. And he once told a story that really shows how much God loves us and how we can never be disconnected from God's love. And it goes like this. There was a young man who asked for his inheritance a little prematurely, like while his father was still alive. So he took that inheritance and started going far away and using up that money, making all kinds of poor choices, unwise decisions, thinking maybe that he could find some sort of happiness or maybe some value and worth in all the wrong kinds of ways, until he ended up using up all his money and he ended up broke. He ended up starving. He had to get a job feeding pigs. Now, I love pigs. They're one of my favorite farm animals. But in this young man's culture, pigs were considered unclean. So he was doing the dirtiest, least respected job a guy could do. Now, if this story was told today, don't you think that this young man might have been labeled entitled or privileged? Don't you think he probably felt pretty high on that human worthiness index when he started, and then slowly he started feeling lower and lower until he ended up in the pig pen, maybe a 0 or a negative? And that's the problem with basing our value or worth on this human worthiness index, on what the world says gives us our value, because it's always limited and things change in our lives. And we'll always end up on the short end of the stick at some point. I mean, if we think that our value or worth is dependent, say we're a student, completely on being a student, and then we graduate or we leave school somehow, where does that leave our sense of value or worth? Or if we think that our worth is dependent completely on our job as a parent, and then our kids grow up and leave and we're empty nesters, or if it's dependent upon our job and then we retire or maybe we get laid off, or if it's dependent upon some sort of relationship and then that relationship changes. These are all really important aspects of our lives. But it's not so much the position or the title that we hold that gives us our value and worth. It's not even what we do. It's how we do it. It's by bringing those godlike qualities right into our lives, right into our world. That's what makes us so valued and needed. It's pretty well known that when people retire, they suddenly don't know what their purpose is anymore. And with the past year, all the stay-at-home orders, it wasn't just retirement age folks, but people of all ages were just at home all the time and began to question does anything I do matter anymore? That was a big concern for mental health professionals. But if we can base our value on something that's permanent, something that never changes, then we'll find that our value can never change. And what is it that never changes? It's God. God emanating out all this goodness, and all of us as God's emanation, as God's offspring, as God's effect. And so we can see that our value never diminishes. It never grows old. We'll all be just as valuable as we've ever been. Well, back to this young man wallowing in the pig pen. He starts to think of his father and maybe his connection to his father, or he realizes that his father always had enough food for all of his hired hands. And here he was, still working his tail off and starving. So he decides to go back to his father. But he doesn't feel that he deserves to go back as a son after all those things he's done and wasted. So he decides he'll go back as a hired hand. And we may have all felt that way at times too, that we just don't deserve good in our lives. Maybe we've done something so awful we think that we just can't ever rectify it or make up for it. Maybe we just feel like we just keep messing up over and over again, or that we're just a bad person. Well, that's like looking at that really limited, dim view of who we really are. And we shift that to recognize that we're that effect of God. And we'll see that we're always valuable, and we're always deserving of good. And so everyone is deserving of good. Well, this young man discovers that. He goes back to his father. His father gives him a big, warm embrace and just won't accept that he come back as a hired hand. You see, he's a son, and that can never change. He'll always be that son. And that's the same with you and I. We'll always be God's offspring, no matter what. And we can never be disconnected from all that goodness of God. Well, so far today, I've just talked about how getting this clearer sense of our value and worth has such an impact on individual lives. But what happens as we expand that and recognize it's not just me, but everyone is needed? Well, that broadens our impact on others, on friends, family, neighbors, on the community. What's needed more in a bread recipe? Flour, water, or yeast? Well, they're each unique ingredients, and they're each essential. No one is more needed than another. No one is more important than another. Without each one of those ingredients, bread can't be made. And it's the same in God's universe. Each one of us is a unique, essential ingredient. And that's what makes us each equal. We're equally essential. And God's universe won't exist in its allness and fullness without each and every one of us. That shows that we're all equal. And that includes those from different backgrounds from ours, those who might have differing points of view, those who might have conflicting interests, and even those who we might think are a threat to ourselves or to others or to things that we hold dear. Now, that doesn't mean that we just accept or allow ungodlike thoughts or behaviors, either in ourselves or in others. but it's really our way to work at reducing those things. I know a man who, for many years, felt harassed by law enforcement. He had no police record, and yet he found that he was frequently pulled over, asked to be searched. One time, about a dozen squad cars were following him, and for no apparent reason, except for perhaps the color of his skin, because this man is black. So he considered that to be racial profiling, and it just made him so angry, made him feel violated, and also it was humiliating. Well, one night, once again, he was pulled over. He just left a parking lot, pulled out onto the street, forgotten to turn on his lights, and whoop, he was pulled right over. Well, the officer started to approach his car and was yelling and said that he smelled drugs in his car and demanded that he get out and allow him to search the car. Well, this man wasn't so sure that that was such a good idea. The police officer kept insisting, and then finally the police officer said that if he didn't allow him to search his car, that he would call in and get a court order to have it searched, and he would search it right then. And then the police officer stepped back and gave him a minute to decide whether or not he was going to allow his car to be searched. Now, in the past, this man would have just been fuming at this point. But he'd just been to one of those Christian Science meetings that I described earlier. And in that meeting, he'd heard a lot about the true nature of God's offspring. And he didn't just leave that at the church door when he exited. Just like we don't leave that in our prayers, or when we leave our house, we take these ideas with us. So he was prepared for this in a way, and he acted completely different and felt completely different. He started to think about this police officer as being godlike. And he could see a lot of godlike traits to this man. He was doing a service to the community. And that service was to provide safety, security, to help people be obedient and obey the laws. And he could appreciate all of this. And whatever seemed to him to be ungodlike, he could just push that out and see that that had no part in this man's true character. He just sort of wrapped this officer in love. And he said that as he thought of this officer in this way, he noticed the demeanor starting to change. And in a minute, the officer walked over to him and said in a very gentle voice, "Sir, I'm sorry to inform you, but I'm going to have to give you a ticket for driving without your lights." No mention of drugs, no mention of a search. This man was just so grateful. He accepted the ticket and left. And he wrote, afterwards, he wrote this about it. He said, "My prayer helped not only me, but the officers as well. I learned that I don't ever have to feel helpless about injustice of any kind. And I now see prayer as a proactive way to handle tense situations." And he handled something there that could have gone a lot differently. And we've seen lots of examples of that. So you see, valuing others as godlike doesn't ignore the bad things that we see going on around us. Rather, it's how we work at eliminating them. And if you think of some of the issues that are bubbling up in your community, some of the issues that are bubbling up in Lexington, Massachusetts, and think of how by starting from this basis, how that's such a good foundation, whether it's prejudice, discrimination, whether it's some of the inequality issues that we see, the divisiveness, polarization, or maybe something else like the loss of income or income inequality. When we start from the basis that everyone is equal and everyone is needed, that helps find solutions. And as this man's experience shows, we don't have to wait for anyone else to get it. We just start with this clearer view ourselves, with this view that we get from the Bible and science and health. And we can see then how that's how we can have a larger impact on our community. Well, I've talked a lot today about the Human Worthiness Index. What about our worthiness to God? Is there some sort of index for that? No, because we're all essential. We're 100% essential, and there's no shades or degrees to essentialness. And getting a clearer sense of that and feeling that connection to God's goodness can help you and bring progress and healing to your life in any way that you need. Well, thank you all for taking time out of your day to share this time with me today. I've sure enjoyed it. I want to thank my producer, Eric Scheel, for helping with all the technical aspects as well as the illustrations and photos. I hope you enjoyed those. And a thank you to the sponsoring church, First Church of Christ Scientist in Lexington, Massachusetts. And in a minute here, we're going to put up a slide. So get your pencil ready and you can take down contact information. And maybe you want to see how you can get a hold of a Bible or Science and Health, or you have some question, or you want to join one of their meetings. And feel free to contact these folks. I've been in contact with them and they're more than happy. They'll be more than happy to talk with you. I'd like to just end with this favorite passage of mine from the book of Romans. And I am convinced that nothing can ever separate us from God's love. Death can't, and life can't. The angels can't, and the demons can't. Our fears for today, our worries about tomorrow, and even the powers of hell can't keep God's love away. Whether we are high above the sky or in the deepest ocean, nothing in all creation will ever be able to separate us from the love of God that is revealed in Christ Jesus our Lord. So as we leave, I hope that you can just feel God loving you, cherishing you, tenderly caring for you, and that you can feel your connection, your inseparable connection from God. And it's that, being the effect of God and the effect of all of that godlikeness, that gives you your worth and value and all those qualities that are so needed today in today's world. And that all of this just makes you feel enabled and able and empowered to live your life as that wonderful, awesome person that God has created you to be.